Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to completely unpack the fascinating, hidden mechanics of how nations shape exactly what you think and feel. Seriously, every single day, as you scroll through your feeds, read the morning news, or even just debate global events with your friends, you are walking right through an invisible architecture of influence built by state actors. So today, we're going to look under the hood of these operations and break down the actual science and strategy behind them.
Okay, let's dive right in by asking a pretty provocative question. Is public diplomacy just a polite, dressed-up word for propaganda? This actually traces back to the mid-1960s. See, after World War I, the word propaganda picked up a really dark, toxic stigma. People associated it with deception and the so-called black arts. So an American diplomat named Edmund Gullion came along and coined a brand new term, public diplomacy. He basically noted that while propaganda was absolutely the most accurate description of what states were doing to influence foreign audiences, they really needed a euphemism. So, does that mean they're the exact same thing?
Well, to answer that, here is our roadmap for today. 1. Diplomacy versus propaganda. 2. Mechanisms of modern persuasion. 3. Strategic narrative warfare. And 4. The global South perspective.
Starting with Part 1, Diplomacy versus Propaganda, the euphemism debate.
While both of these concepts exist to project state power and achieve non-altruistic goals, scholar Jan Mellison highlights a fundamental divergence between the two. Think of it like this. Public diplomacy requires an architecture of credibility. It's fundamentally a two-way street that involves listening, actual dialogue, and factual exposition aimed at long-term mutual understanding. Propaganda? That is a one-way street. It relies heavily on forced messaging through sheer repetition and emotional manipulation, all with one very specific goal in mind: behavioral modification. When you look at the DIME framework, which stands for diplomacy, information, military, and economics, both public diplomacy and propaganda sit squarely within that information pillar of national power. They share the exact same toolkit. We're talking mass media, broadcasting, cultural exchanges, the whole shebang. The critical difference isn't the tools they use, but the intent and the structural flow of the information. One tries to attract you through soft power, while the other leans a lot closer to coercive psychological force.
Which brings us to Part 2, Mechanisms of Modern Persuasion, the Color Spectrum, and Psychological Exploitation. What's truly fascinating is how states officially categorize their messaging into a literal color spectrum. White propaganda is totally transparent. Think of a standard official press release where the source is clearly attributed. You know exactly who is talking to you. Then you have gray propaganda, which is where things get a bit murky. The true source is hidden to make the message feel like a completely authentic, grassroots opinion. And finally, black propaganda. This is covert deception. This is where a state might actually impersonate their enemy to broadcast embarrassing or inflammatory content from within the opponent's own territory. It's literally a false flag in information form.
But to understand why these campaigns actually work on us, we have to look to Nobel laureate Herbert Simon. His theory is brilliant because it shifts the focus away from the propagandist and directly onto us, the audience. He coined the term cognitive misers. Think about your own everyday experience with social media doom scrolling, right? You are bombarded with more data in a single afternoon than your brain can possibly process. Modern propagandists know this. They know you absolutely do not have the time or energy to logically verify every single claim. So they exploit this exhaustion. They wrap their strategic messages in emotional triggers that activate your pre-existing biases. They just bypass your logical scrutiny entirely, aiming straight for your emotional shortcuts. And that leads us into Part 3, Strategic Narrative Warfare, the modern cognitive battle space.
Through a completely impartial academic lens, we can contrast how different state actors operate in the digital space today. For instance, Israel employs an elite-driven institutional model known as Hasbara, which essentially focuses on explanation and justification. They rely heavily on white propaganda, overtly attributing their messaging through a security frame that emphasizes counterterrorism, and they specifically target Western policymakers. Iran, conversely, uses a highly decentralized platform-native model called Jange Narm, or soft war. They deploy gray propaganda through decentralized digital proxies, utilizing a moral frame focused on anti-imperialism, heavily targeting the global South and Western youth demographics.
The escalation funnel in the digital infosphere maps out this strategic intent perfectly. Israel utilizes what we call epistemic compression. That basically means they package raw, technical drone footage and present it as objective, unassailable proof to validate military behavior. Iran's network model, on the other hand, aims for affective resonance. They prioritize emotional shock value, provocative humor, and cultural legibility to trigger viral shockwaves on platforms like TikTok and Telegram. They are trying to bypass traditional media gatekeepers entirely.
Now, to execute massive operations like this, you need immense capital. To put this into perspective, Israel utilizes a staggering public diplomacy budget of roughly $730 million. This capital-intensive apparatus is used to foster dedicated media war rooms that literally monitor hundreds of outlets and tens of thousands of daily items just to aggressively control the security narrative in real time.
But how do these narratives actually land? Let's get into Part 4, the Global South Perspective, Competing Master Narratives.
Here is the golden rule. Public diplomacy only works if the underlying policy is actually saleable to the target audience. In Malaysia, for example, the Western security frame, which emphasizes regional stability and counterterrorism, often completely clashes with the region's internal ideological filters. When the underlying policy is viewed with intense skepticism by the locals, official public diplomacy isn't seen as the truth. It's perceived as a big lie.
So the crucial takeaway here is that narratives do not exist in a vacuum. They have to pass through local filters. The Western master narrative focuses on precision strikes and security, but Malaysia's internal ideological filter is deeply driven by post-colonial resistance and Islamic solidarity. Therefore, Iran's asymmetric moral frame perfectly aligns with Malaysia's historical memory. It acts as this massive force multiplier for Iran's messaging, while the Western frame just gets largely rejected.
And this brings us to the absolute technological crisis of our time, the verification lag. Across platforms like Telegram, which acts as the unfiltered trenches of raw conflict footage, and TikTok, the algorithmic insurgency, we see this incredibly dangerous three-step loop. First, content is rapidly generated, often utilizing AI or synthetic imagery. Next, it's immediately amplified by decentralized proxies. And finally, believe. By the time institutional facts can actually be verified by experts, the audience has already chosen to believe the lie. Emotional truth wildly outpaces factual verification. Ultimately, state narratives must pass through systemic filters to be successful. Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky's famous propaganda model highlights 5 distinct gates: ownership, funding, sourcing, flack, and ideology. A state-sponsored narrative has to successfully navigate the corporate media structure, rely on institutional sourcing, and align with an overarching ideology before it ever reaches an audience. An audience that, as we learned earlier with the cognitive misers concept, is already completely overwhelmed by the digital age.
I want to leave you with a really provocative thought derived from Cheryl Tuttle Ross's epistemic merit model. She argues that modern propaganda isn't just about simple, obvious falsehoods anymore. It's an epistemic struggle. It is a literal battle over how reality is known. In a digital space where credibility is aggressively negotiated and where states use highly curated, multiple, credible truths to shape your emotional responses, what does absolute truth even mean anymore? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning the architecture of the information you consume every single day.